I watched in horror as Sheriff Corinne raised the crowbar above her head and brought it crashing down on my satellite dish. The metal screamed as it bent and twisted under her rage. 3 years of astronomical research data vanished in seconds. My hands shook as I held up my phone, recording every moment of destruction while she screamed about eyesores and troublemakers. What she did not know was that NASA was watching too. And that is when I realized this small-town tyrant had just declared war on the federal government. My name is David, and for the past 5 years, I had lived the quiet life of a dream in rural Montana. After retiring from my engineering career in Denver, I bought 12 acres of pristine land 30 miles outside of Whitefish. The closest neighbor was half a mile away, and the night sky stretched endlessly above me without a single streetlight to dim the stars. I had always been fascinated by space. As a child, I spent countless nights with my telescope, mapping constellations and dreaming of distant galaxies. When I finally had the land and the freedom to pursue that passion seriously, I built something extraordinary. My satellite dish array consisted of 4 precisely aligned dishes, each one calibrated to capture different frequencies from deep space radio sources. The setup was not just a hobby. I was part of NASA's Radio Jove program, a citizen science initiative that relied on amateur astronomers like me to monitor Jupiter's radio emissions and solar activity. My data contributed to real research papers. University of Montana graduate students regularly collaborated with me on projects tracking solar flares and their effects on Earth's magnetic field. Every morning, I would walk out to my equipment with a cup of coffee and check the overnight recordings. The dishes hummed quietly as they tracked their targets across the sky. Solar panels powered the entire operation cleanly and silently. I had invested nearly $40,000 in professional-grade equipment, and every penny was worth it when I discovered a previously unknown radio source in the Andromeda Galaxy. The paperwork had been exhaustive but necessary. I obtained building permits for the dish foundations, electrical permits for the power systems, and even filed environmental impact studies with the county. The Federal Communications Commission licensed my radio equipment. NASA provided official documentation of my research collaboration. I kept every document in fireproof filing cabinets because I knew how important proper documentation could be. For 3 years, life was perfect. I published my findings in amateur astronomy journals. Local schools invited me to speak about space exploration. The university featured my work in their newsletter. I felt like I was contributing something meaningful to human knowledge while living exactly the life I had always wanted. But perfection never lasts in small towns, especially when there are people who see anything different as a threat. Sheriff Karen Martinez had been the law in Stillwater County for 8 years. People whispered about her temper and her need to control everything that happened in her jurisdiction. She had a reputation for harassing anyone who did not fit her narrow definition of normal small-town life. Artists, writers, anyone who worked from home, anyone who looked different or thought differently became targets of her attention. I first heard about her from my neighbor, Bill Thompson, who lived on the adjacent property. He mentioned that Sheriff Karen had been asking questions about the strange equipment on my land. She wanted to know if I was running some kind of business without proper licensing. Bill had defended me, explaining that I was just a retired engineer pursuing astronomy, but he warned me that Sheriff Karen did not like explanations that made her feel stupid. The warning proved prophetic when she showed up at my gate on a cold October morning. Sheriff Karen Martinez stepped out of her patrol car like she was preparing for battle. She was a stocky woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything as either a threat or an annoyance. Her hand rested on her service weapon as she approached my front door, even though I was clearly unarmed and standing peacefully on my own property. "You David Chen," she demanded without introducing herself. "Yes, ma'am, can I help you?" "I am Sheriff Martinez. I have received multiple complaints about noise violations and zoning infractions on this property." She gestured toward my satellite dishes with obvious disgust. "This residential area is not zoned for commercial radio operations." I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "Sheriff, I think there might be some misunderstanding. These are research instruments for astronomy, not commercial radio equipment. I have all the proper permits and licenses. Would you like to see them?" Her face reddened immediately. "Do not tell me what I understand and what I do not understand. I have been doing this job since before you moved to my county with your big city attitude." "I am not trying to challenge your authority," I said carefully. "I just want to show you the documentation that proves everything here is completely legal." She followed me into my house, her boots heavy on the hardwood floors. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out folder after folder of permits, licenses, and official correspondence. Building permits signed by the County Planning Department, FCC radio operator licenses, NASA collaboration agreements on official letterhead, environmental impact assessments, insurance documentation for the equipment. Sheriff Karen barely glanced at the papers before pushing them aside. "I do not care what some bureaucrats in Washington think they know about my county. Those dishes are an eyesore. They are probably interfering with emergency radio communications, and they are bringing down property values for your neighbors." "Sheriff, the FCC specifically tested my equipment for interference issues. These frequencies do not conflict with emergency services, and I have letters from NASA confirming the scientific importance of this research." "NASA," she repeated with a sneer. "You think you are some kind of rocket scientist. This is cattle country, not Cape Canaveral. People move here for peace and quiet, not to have their view ruined by your science fiction nonsense." Her dismissive tone sparked something angry in my chest, but I forced myself to stay professional. "I understand concerns about aesthetics, but this equipment is positioned to minimize visual impact on neighbors. The nearest house cannot even see the dishes because of the tree line." "That is not the point," she snapped. "The point is that you think you can do whatever you want because you have money and connections. Well, this is not Denver, and I am not impressed by your fancy papers." She stood up and looked down at me with pure contempt. "I am giving you 30 days to remove that equipment, or I will remove it for you. And if I hear one more complaint about noise, interference, or anything else related to your little space project, I will find violations you never knew existed." "Sheriff, with all due respect, you cannot order me to remove legally permitted equipment from my own property without due process. If you believe there are violations, I have the right to contest them through proper legal channels." Her hand moved back to her weapon. "Are you threatening me?" "No, ma'am. I am simply explaining my legal rights." "Your legal rights are what I say they are in my county. You would be wise to remember that." She walked out without another word, leaving me standing in my living room with a stack of useless permits and a growing sense that my peaceful life was about to become a nightmare. Sheriff Karen made good on her implicit threats, but not in ways I could have anticipated. She began what I can only describe as a campaign of systematic harassment designed to make my life miserable, while staying just barely within the bounds of legal police activity. It started with the drive-bys. Every morning at exactly 7:30, her patrol car would cruise slowly past my property. She would stop at the gate and sit there for several minutes, making notes on a clipboard while staring at my equipment. Sometimes she brought other deputies with her who would point at the dishes and shake their heads in apparent disapproval. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. I found myself watching for her car every morning, my stomach knotting with anxiety when 7:30 approached. My peaceful morning routine of checking overnight data became a tense affair conducted while constantly looking over my shoulder. Then came the wellness checks. Sheriff Karen began showing up at random hours, claiming that concerned neighbors had reported suspicious activity on my property. She would demand to inspect my equipment for safety violations, claiming that electrical systems posed fire hazards to the surrounding forest. Each inspection required me to shut down active research projects and escort her around my property while she looked for any excuse to cite violations. "This electrical panel is not up to code," she announced during one inspection, pointing at my professionally installed breaker box. "That panel was inspected and approved by the county electrical inspector," I replied, showing her the signed approval certificate. "Well, codes change. I will have to bring our inspector out here to verify compliance." The county inspector arrived 3 days later, spent 10 minutes confirming that everything was perfect, and apologized for wasting my time. But Sheriff Karen had accomplished her goal. My research was interrupted for an entire week while I waited for the inspection. The harassment escalated when she began recruiting other officials to support her campaign. The fire marshal suddenly needed to inspect my property for wildfire compliance. The health department wanted to verify that my septic system could handle a commercial operation. The zoning board required me to attend hearings to defend permits I had already obtained years earlier. Each agency visit required me to take time away from my research to produce documentation, answer questions, and prove my compliance with regulations I had already satisfied. Most officials were apologetic and professional, clearly recognizing that they were being used as weapons in Sheriff Karen's personal vendetta. But the damage was done. My work was constantly interrupted, my data collection suffered gaps, and my stress levels skyrocketed. I began documenting everything. Every interaction with Sheriff Karen was recorded on my phone. Every inspection was photographed. Every official visit was logged with dates, times, and witness statements. I kept detailed records of how the harassment was affecting my research and my collaboration with NASA and the university. My breaking point came during a particularly important data collection session. NASA had asked me to monitor a series of solar flares that were expected to produce spectacular radio emissions. The timing was critical because the flares were predicted to peak during a narrow window when Jupiter would be optimally positioned for observation. I had been collecting data for 18 hours straight when Sheriff Karen arrived with 2 deputies, and a warrant claiming that neighbors had reported suspicious electronic signals that might be interfering with aircraft navigation. She demanded that I shut down all equipment immediately while they conducted a search for illegal radio transmitters. "Sheriff, I am in the middle of a time-sensitive NASA research project. Can this wait until tomorrow?" "NASA research," she mocked. "Right. Turn off your equipment now or I will arrest you for obstruction." I watched helplessly as 3 years of careful preparation for this specific solar event evaporated because of her petty vindictiveness. The solar flares peaked while my equipment sat silent under her investigation, which found no violations because none existed. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I contacted a civil rights attorney in Billings and began building a federal case for harassment under color of authority. I also reached out to my contacts at NASA and the university to document how Sheriff Corinne's actions were interfering with legitimate scientific research. I had tried to resolve this situation through local channels and proper legal procedures. Since Sheriff Corinne preferred to abuse her power rather than follow the law, it was time to introduce her to consequences she could not intimidate or control. The morning of November 15th started like any other, but it ended with Sheriff Corinne crossing a line that transformed her from a local bully into a federal criminal. I had no way of knowing that her final act of destruction would be witnessed by more people than she could have imagined. I was conducting a routine data collection session with the university when my phone rang. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the physics department was calling to coordinate our observation of a rare radio source that had appeared in the Cygnus constellation. NASA had requested that all citizen science participants focus their equipment on specific coordinates to triangulate the signal. "David, we are getting amazing data from your location," Dr. Mitchell said excitedly. "Your equipment is picking up frequencies that our lab dishes are missing. Can you maintain focus on those coordinates for the next 4 hours?" "Absolutely. I will keep everything locked on target and send you real-time data feeds." What I did not realize was that Sheriff Corinne had been watching my property since dawn, waiting for an opportunity to strike. She had grown increasingly frustrated as her harassment campaign failed to drive me away or provoke me into doing something she could arrest me for. My careful documentation and legal compliance had protected me from her previous attacks, but they had also made her more desperate and dangerous. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, while I was transmitting live data to NASA and 3 universities, Sheriff Corinne arrived with 4 deputies, and what she claimed was an emergency response to reports of illegal radio transmissions disrupting emergency services. I met them at the gate with my phone already recording. "Sheriff, I am currently conducting authorized scientific research in cooperation with NASA. My equipment is fully licensed and poses no interference to emergency communications." "That is what you claim," she replied, her face flushed with anger. "But I have reports of ambulances losing radio contact when they drive past your property. That makes your equipment a public safety hazard, and I have the authority to remove any hazard immediately." "Sheriff, those claims are false. My equipment operates on amateur radio frequencies that do not conflict with emergency services. I can show you the FCC documentation." "I do not want to see any more of your papers," she snapped. "I want to see this junk removed from my county once and for all." She gestured to her deputies, and they began moving toward my satellite dishes with crowbars and bolt cutters. I felt panic rising in my chest as I realized she intended to destroy everything. "Sheriff, please wait. You cannot destroy my property without due process. I have rights." "Your rights end where public safety begins," she said, grabbing a crowbar from one of her deputies. What happened next was captured on my phone's camera, transmitted live to researchers at 3 universities, and recorded by NASA's data monitoring systems. Sheriff Corinne raised the crowbar above her head and brought it crashing down on my primary satellite dish with a sound like thunder. The metal screamed as it bent and twisted. Years of precise calibration were destroyed in seconds. She moved to the second dish, then the third, her face twisted with satisfaction as she demolished equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars. "Stop," I shouted. "You are destroying scientific research equipment. This is a federal crime." "This is my county," she panted between swings, "and I decide what belongs here." My phone was shaking in my hands as I tried to document everything while fighting back tears of rage and helplessness. The deputies looked uncomfortable but did nothing to stop her rampage. One of them even helped by cutting cables that connected the dishes to my computer systems. Within 30 minutes, my entire research operation was reduced to twisted metal and severed cables. 3 years of data collection were lost. Ongoing collaborations with NASA and multiple universities were terminated in the most violent way possible. Equipment that had contributed to genuine scientific discoveries lay scattered across my property like the aftermath of a tornado. Sheriff Karen stood among the wreckage, breathing heavily and grinning with obvious satisfaction. "Clean up this mess," she ordered. "And if I see any more unauthorized equipment on this property, I will be back to remove it too." As her patrol cars disappeared down my driveway, I stood alone among the ruins of my life's work. But I was not as helpless as she believed. My phone had recorded everything. NASA's computers had logged the sudden termination of data transmission during active research. University researchers had heard the destruction happening in real time over our communication channels. Sheriff Karen thought she had won a victory over an annoying citizen who refused to be intimidated. What she had actually done was commit multiple federal felonies while being observed by scientists, government agencies, and recording devices she never knew existed. The war she thought she was ending had just begun. The morning after Sheriff Karen destroyed my equipment, I sat in my living room staring at a phone that would not stop ringing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had called 3 times. NASA's citizen science coordinator had left urgent voicemails. Even researchers from universities I had never worked with directly were reaching out after hearing about the incident through academic networks. The first call I returned was to Dr. Mitchell at the University of Montana. Her voice was tight with anger when she answered. "David, what happened yesterday was absolutely inexcusable. We have never seen anything like this in 20 years of citizen science collaboration. Are you okay?" "I am shaken up, but I am not hurt," I replied. "I am more concerned about the lost research and the impact on your projects." "That is what I am calling about. The data you were collecting yesterday was not just for our local research. You were part of a multi-institutional study funded by a National Science Foundation grant. The radio source you were tracking is only visible for a few days every several years. We cannot replace that data." My stomach dropped. I had no idea the scope was that large. "It gets worse," Dr. Mitchell continued. "Your equipment was calibrated specifically for frequencies that complement NASA's Deep Space Monitoring Network. When your signal cut out yesterday, it created a gap in our coverage that affects national space weather prediction models." I felt something shift inside me as I realized the true magnitude of what Sheriff Karen had destroyed. This was not just my personal hobby or even a simple university collaboration. My research station had been an integral part of federal scientific infrastructure. "Dr. Mitchell, who should I contact about this? I need to report what happened to the appropriate authorities." "I already made some calls," she said grimly. "NASA's Office of Inspector General wants to speak with you immediately. The destruction of equipment contributing to federally funded research is a serious matter. And David, there might be criminal implications for whoever did this." 2 hours later, I was on a conference call with officials from NASA, the National Science Foundation, and the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit. The conversation was surreal. These were people who dealt with national security threats and crimes against federal agencies, and they were talking about my backyard satellite dishes with the same seriousness they might reserve for attacks on government facilities. "Mr. Chen," said Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI, Can you confirm that your equipment was destroyed while actively participating in federally funded research activities? Yes, ma'am. I have recordings of the entire incident, plus data logs showing the exact time my transmission to NASA was interrupted. And the person who destroyed this equipment was acting under color of state authority. Sheriff Karen Martinez claimed she was responding to emergency reports and had the authority to remove what she called a public safety hazard. She was in uniform and brought 4 deputies with her. There was a long pause before Agent Torres spoke again. Mr. Chen, what Sheriff Martinez did yesterday constitutes destruction of federal property, interference with government operations, and violation of your civil rights under federal law. These are felony charges that carry significant prison time. The weight of those words hit me like a physical blow. Sheriff Karen had transformed overnight from a local bully into a federal criminal, and she had no idea what was coming for her. Dr. James Harrison from NASA's Citizen Science program joined the call with news that made everything even more serious. Mr. Chen, I have been reviewing your contribution records. Over the past 3 years, your station has provided data for 12 peer-reviewed research papers, contributed to solar weather models that protect satellite communications, and help track potentially hazardous space debris. The economic value of replacing your contributions would exceed $2 million, he continued. But the scientific value of the lost data and interrupted research is irreplaceable. I sat in stunned silence as federal officials discussed investigating Sheriff Karen Martinez like she was a terrorist who had attacked a government facility. In her ignorance and arrogance, she had picked a fight with opponents who operated on a level she could not even comprehend. The small-town sheriff who thought she could intimidate anyone in her county was about to learn about consequences that existed far beyond her jurisdiction and her understanding. Special Agent Rebecca Torres arrived in Whitefish 3 days after my conference call with federal agencies. She was a compact woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to investigating serious crimes. When she sat across from me in my living room, I realized that Sheriff Karen's small-town world was about to collide with federal law enforcement in the most devastating way possible. Mr. Chen, I want to walk through exactly what happened, starting with the first time Sheriff Martinez contacted you, Agent Torres said, opening a thick folder. Federal prosecutors need a complete timeline of harassment and civil rights violations leading up to the destruction of your equipment. For the next 4 hours, I provided detailed accounts of every interaction with Sheriff Karen. Agent Torres photographed my documentation, copied my recordings, and took statements about each incident of harassment. She was particularly interested in Sheriff Karen's pattern of recruiting other agencies to harass me without legitimate cause. This shows clear abuse of power under color of authority, Agent Torres explained. When law enforcement officers use their position to deprive citizens of constitutional rights, it becomes a federal crime regardless of state or local laws. But the most damaging evidence was the recordings I had made during the destruction of my equipment. Agent Torres played them back multiple times, taking notes on Sheriff Karen's statements about having the authority to destroy my property and her dismissive attitude toward my legal rights. She explicitly stated that your rights are whatever she says they are, Agent Torres observed. That is textbook civil rights violation. Combined with the destruction of federally supported research equipment, we have multiple felony charges. The investigation moved quickly because Sheriff Karen had left such an obvious trail of evidence. Agent Torres interviewed my neighbors, who confirmed the pattern of harassment and surveillance. She obtained records of the bogus inspections Sheriff Karen had ordered from various county agencies. She even found witnesses among Sheriff Karen's own deputies who were uncomfortable with her actions. Deputy Mike Williams proved to be a crucial witness. He had been present during the destruction of my equipment and was visibly disturbed by what he had seen. Sheriff Martinez has been out of control for months, he told Agent Torres during a recorded interview. She became obsessed with getting rid of Mr. Chen and his equipment. She kept saying that people needed to know their place in her county. Did you attempt to stop the destruction of Mr. Chen's property? Agent Torres asked. I tried to suggest that we should verify his claims about having proper permits before taking action, Deputy Williams replied. But she told me that she did not care about permits or documentation. She said Mr. Chen needed to learn that his big city attitudes would not work in her county. The most shocking revelation came when Agent Torres discovered that Sheriff Karen had been lying about the emergency reports that supposedly justified her actions. No ambulance service had ever reported radio interference from my equipment. No aircraft had filed complaints about navigation disruption. The concerned neighbors, who allegedly contacted her department, did not exist in official records. Sheriff Karen had fabricated the entire emergency scenario to justify destroying my property in what she thought would appear to be a legitimate law enforcement response. Instead, she had created a federal case for conspiracy to violate civil rights and destruction of government property. The investigation expanded when Agent Torres began examining Sheriff Karen's other activities as sheriff. My case was not isolated. She had a pattern of harassing anyone who did not fit her narrow definition of acceptable behavior in her county. Artists, writers, retirees from other states, and anyone with education or opinions that challenged her authority became targets of selective enforcement and manufactured violations. Mr. Chen, you may have saved other people from years of harassment, Agent Torres told me. Sheriff Martinez has been operating like a small-town dictator, and no one has had the resources or documentation to challenge her effectively. The county commissioners learned about the federal investigation through news reports, since Sheriff Karen had not informed them about destroying federally supported research equipment. Their panicked response was to immediately distance themselves from her actions and suspend her pending the outcome of the investigation. Sheriff Karen's reaction to suspension was to double down on her harassment tactics. She began calling my neighbors to warn them about cooperating with federal agents. She tried to intimidate Deputy Williams into changing his testimony. She even attempted to access county records to identify other people who might testify against her. Each action made her legal situation worse and provided federal prosecutors with additional charges. The small-town sheriff who thought she was above accountability was discovering that federal crimes bring federal consequences that no amount of local political influence can prevent. The federal courthouse in Great Falls was packed on the morning of Sheriff Karen Martinez's arraignment. Word had spread throughout the county that their sheriff was facing serious federal charges, and people wanted to see justice served. I sat in the gallery watching the woman who had terrorized me for months shuffle into court wearing handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. The charges read by the federal prosecutor were devastating: destruction of federal property, conspiracy to violate civil rights, abuse of power under color of authority, filing false police reports, witness intimidation. Each count carried years in federal prison, and the prosecutor made it clear that Sheriff Karen would face the full weight of federal justice. Your Honor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Wells began, The defendant systematically harassed and intimidated a citizen engaged in legitimate scientific research in cooperation with NASA and multiple universities. When that harassment failed to achieve her goal of driving the victim from the county, she fabricated emergency scenarios to justify destroying tens of thousands of dollars in scientific equipment. Sheriff Corin's court-appointed attorney tried to argue that she had been acting in good faith based on citizen complaints, but the prosecutor dismantled that defense with devastating efficiency. Your Honor, FBI investigation has determined that no such citizen complaints existed. Emergency services never reported radio interference. The defendant invented these justifications to mask a personal vendetta against someone whose lifestyle and education she found threatening. The most powerful moment came when Dr. James Harrison from NASA testified about the impact of Sheriff Corin's actions on federal research programs. Mr. Chen's research station was an integral part of our citizen science network, Dr. Harrison explained. His data contributed to space weather models that protect satellite communications and GPS systems used by millions of Americans. The destruction of his equipment created a gap in our monitoring coverage that cannot be easily replaced. What is the financial impact of replacing Mr. Chen's contributions? The prosecutor asked. The equipment alone was worth approximately $40,000, but the research data and ongoing collaborations that were lost have a value exceeding $2 million. More importantly, some of the astronomical phenomena Mr. Chen was tracking will not be observable again for several years. Sheriff Corin's face grew paler as she realized the magnitude of what she had destroyed in her ignorant rage. She had thought she was demolishing some retiree's expensive hobby. Instead, she had attacked infrastructure that served national scientific and security interests. The community impact testimony was equally damaging. Deputy Mike Williams described the culture of harassment and intimidation that Sheriff Corin had created in the department. County commissioners testified about bogus inspection requests and manufactured emergencies that had wasted taxpayer resources. Citizens who had been targets of her previous harassment campaigns found courage to speak publicly about years of abuse. Sheriff Martinez turned law enforcement into a personal weapon, testified Maria Santos, a local artist who had been repeatedly cited for operating an art studio in her home. She harassed anyone who was different, anyone who had education or opinions that challenged her authority. But the most devastating testimony came from her own deputies, who described a sheriff who had become increasingly obsessed with controlling every aspect of life in her county. She told us that people needed to know their place, Deputy Williams testified. If someone moved here from a city, or had a college degree, or did anything she considered weird, they became targets. She used the badge as a weapon against anyone who made her feel stupid or challenged. Sheriff Corin's attorney attempted to present character witnesses, but the damage was too severe. Her years of abuse had created too many victims and too much documented evidence. Even longtime supporters distanced themselves when they learned about the federal charges and the extent of her misconduct. The judge denied bail, ruling that Sheriff Corin posed a flight risk and a continuing danger to the community. The defendant has shown a pattern of escalating abuse of power and intimidation of witnesses. The court cannot risk allowing her to continue harassing citizens while awaiting trial. As Sheriff Corin was led back to her cell, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but at a terrible cost. Her abuse of power had damaged lives, wasted resources, and destroyed trust in law enforcement that would take years to rebuild. The federal charges moved through the system with mechanical efficiency. Sheriff Corin's attempts to intimidate witnesses had been recorded by FBI surveillance. Her lies about emergency reports were exposed by official records. Her pattern of harassment was documented by dozens of victims who finally felt safe to speak out. 6 months later, she pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 years in federal prison. The judge made it clear that her abuse of power would not be tolerated by the federal justice system, regardless of her position or local political connections. "You took an oath to protect and serve the citizens of this county," the judge told her during sentencing. "Instead, you used your position to terrorize anyone who did not conform to your personal prejudices. This court will not allow such abuse to go unpunished." 8 months after Sheriff Corinne Martinez was sentenced to federal prison, I stood in my backyard watching the installation crew position the last of my new satellite dishes. The federal government had provided full compensation for the destroyed equipment, plus additional funding to upgrade my research station to state-of-the-art specifications that exceeded anything I had owned before. The new setup was remarkable: 4 high-precision dishes with computerized tracking systems, advanced signal processing equipment that could detect fainter sources than ever before, solar panels and battery systems that provided completely clean, reliable power. The total value exceeded $100,000, all paid for by the federal restitution ordered as part of Sheriff Corin's sentence. But the financial compensation was only part of the story. NASA had formally recognized my research station as a critical node in their citizen science network, providing me with priority access to observing time and direct collaboration with their most important projects. The University of Montana had offered me an adjunct research position that came with access to their laboratories and graduate student assistants. "David, this is incredible," said Dr. Sarah Mitchell as she toured the new facilities. "You now have better equipment than most university observatories. Your data quality is going to be extraordinary." The first night of operation with the new equipment was magical. I tracked Jupiter's radio emissions with unprecedented clarity, detected previously unknown pulsars, and contributed data to 3 different NASA research projects simultaneously. The forced interruption of my work had actually led to capabilities I never could have afforded on my own. More importantly, the community around me had changed dramatically. Sheriff Corin's removal had lifted a cloud of fear and intimidation that had hung over the county for years. People who had been targeted by her harassment campaigns were finally free to live their lives without constant surveillance and manufactured violations. The new sheriff, elected in a special election after Corin's conviction, was everything she had not been: professional, educated, and committed to actual law enforcement rather than personal power trips. He had visited me personally to apologize for his predecessor's actions and to assure me that such abuse would never happen again. "Mr. Chen, what happened to you was a disgrace to law enforcement," Sheriff David Rodriguez had told me. "My department will earn back the community's trust through professional service and respect for everyone's constitutional rights." The deputies who had participated in Sheriff Corin's harassment campaign faced their own consequences. 2 were terminated for violating department policies. Others received retraining on civil rights and proper law enforcement procedures. Deputy Mike Williams, who had testified against Sheriff Corin, was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of training new officers. My story had become a case study in law enforcement academies about the dangers of abuse of power and the importance of respecting citizens' rights. FBI instructors used recordings of Sheriff Corin's actions to teach agents about recognizing and investigating civil rights violations. But perhaps the most satisfying change was in my own life. What had started as a peaceful retirement hobby had evolved into a meaningful career, contributing to human knowledge about the universe. I was now publishing research papers, mentoring student researchers, and participating in discoveries that would have been impossible without the upgraded equipment that arose from Sheriff Corinne's destructive actions. As I watched Jupiter rise over the Montana horizon on that first night of renewed research, I reflected on how crisis can sometimes lead to opportunities we never could have imagined. Sheriff Corinne had intended to destroy my work and drive me from the county. Instead, her illegal actions had exposed a pattern of abuse that freed an entire community from tyranny and elevated my research to levels I never could have achieved alone. The satellite dishes hummed quietly as they tracked their targets across the star-filled sky. Data flowed to NASA computers, university laboratories, and research projects around the world. The peaceful life I had sought in rural Montana had returned, but stronger and more meaningful than ever before. Sheriff Corinne Martinez was serving her federal sentence in a prison far from the county she had once terrorized. The equipment she had destroyed in ignorant rage had been replaced with instruments that would contribute to human knowledge for decades to come. Justice, it turned out, had its own perfect timing and its own perfect sense of irony.